happens in a vacuum. Everybody is a collection of their experiences and their past. And, I try to show that with each one of these artists. And I think that's one of the things I hope that people get from this book, is they get a better understanding of why, the social justice movement that's going on in this country now, why it's so important, because there's a history to it.
Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today I am with the comics detective, Ken Quattro. How are you doing?
How you doing? I'm doing great, Joy. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It's a historic day in the U.S. right now. And
it is.
Yeah, for those who are watching this, we are filming this on January 20th, 2021. So I first got a wind of your work when I saw you kind of showed the Will Eisner testimony with that infamous Victor Fox case about Wonder Man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, it just kind of fell in my lap almost. It was something I've been researching for years, and because I've always been a huge Will Eisner fan, and I've written a lot of articles about him, talked to him, and stuff like that. And one of the things I'd always been pursuing was trying to find the transcript of this trial, which was when DC Comics sued Victor Fox and his publishing company called Bruns Publishing for copyright infringement. They were the first ones to come out with a superhero after Superman. And they did it within a year after Superman came out. And DC jumped all over them, besides the fact they didn't like Victor Fox. Well, anyways, I'd always heard about this trial. And the reason why is because Eisner always referred to it. He referred to it in one of his graphic novels, The Dreamer, which is basically,
it's an autobiography.
It's basically an autobiography, with just names changed. Anyways, he always referred to the fact that he created this character, Wonder Man. And he claimed that he created the character on orders of Victor Fox. And this is what he claimed for years, that during the trial, he outed Victor Fox. And, that's why Victor Fox ended up losing the case against DC, is because his ethics made him stand up in court and, state the fact that Victor Fox made him commit copyright infringement. Well, finally, the case fell into my lap because a follower of mine, somebody who'd been reading my articles online, I've been doing this for like 20 some years now, happened to be a corporate lawyer for Warner Brothers.
Interesting.
And actually, he's the top corporate lawyer for Warner Brothers, and he's a comic book fan. And he was in New York doing some research at the National Archives. And he came across the transcripts of the trial, and it's like 70 some pages long with all the documentation and everything. And he knew I'd been looking for this, and he said, "Would you be interested in seeing it?" I said, "Well, yeah. I mean, this is something it was something I always wanted to see." Well, when I got it, not only the fact that so many different people and historic figures in comics history had testified during the trial, like everybody from Jerry Siegel to Max Gaines, Victor Fox, and Eisner and Iger, all these other guys that testified during the trial. But the fact that Eisner had lied all those years about his testimony, and because during the trial, he denied that he was told by Victor Fox. He claimed he totally created Wonder Man out of his imagination. He had no idea what Superman was. He was totally oblivious to the character, which was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because he was such a huge, popular character at the time. Anyways, so I came across this, and I'm reading it, and I'm going like, should I show people this? Because like I said, I'm a huge Will Eisner fan. And so I talked to a good friend of mine who was another comics historian. He goes, "Ken," he goes, "you can't pick the history that you like to tell people." He says, "You got to tell people the truth." And so I put it on my on my blog. Well, immediately I got two different reactions. One, people were thrilled to read all this stuff. And then I got a whole bunch of flack from people who are Will Eisner fans saying that you're a traitor. Some people claimed that it was a conspiracy to, just besmirch, Will Eisner's memory and everything like that. Well, I'm holding the documents in my hand. I mean, I printed the whole thing out. It's, it's from the National Archives. So, but the thing is that the lawyer at Warner Brothers wouldn't allow me to release his name because his job would be in jeopardy, possibly, if they found out about this being released. So I had to take all this flack for years, and finally he allowed me to release his name and stuff like that. He's a really good friend of mine now. Actually, he helped me with this book, with Invisible Men, because he's also the guy who smoothed the way for us to be able to use a story from Wonder Woman. And because DC, again, is very protective of their copyrights and stuff like that.
Yeah,
and there's a story in this, in Invisible Men, it's a Sojourner Truth story that was drawn by Alfonso Green. Well, we wanted to use it because it was a historic story as far as, the Black artists were concerned. And Wayne, his name is Wayne Smith. He's a great guy. He works at Warner Brothers. And he's the one who smoothed the way for us. He got all the clearances for us and everything like that. And,
it's kind of fitting that his name is Wayne and he works for Warner Brothers.
Oh, yeah, I know. Yeah. But it was just very cool, the way the whole thing worked out.
I was one of those guys that you mentioned because I was really excited to be reading all that stuff. And
oh, yeah. I mean, people refer to it over and over. It's a gold mine if, you like old comic book history, because there's so many things that you can get out of it. And, I learned so much from it. I've written numerous articles based upon pieces of information I got out of it. And I ended up writing a 50-page article based around it for Alter Ego that was later published. It kind of explained everything that people didn't know what was going on.
But also, I just feel that Will Eisner, he did what any of us would do in that situation.
And that's what I try to explain to everybody, Joy, is that he didn't do anything that was really bad in the sense, I guess, everybody likes to think that they're morally superior, and say, oh, I wouldn't lie for. But here he was a 20, 21-year-old kid. Mm-hmm. This is his biggest client. Victor Fox owed him a couple $1,000s, which at that time was huge. It was basically their biggest source of income, for him and Jerry Iger. So what he did was he was just protecting his client in court, because this was a huge lawsuit. And so he basically just did what anybody else would have done. But the problem was that he'd always made such a big deal out of it himself over the years. He kept bringing it up all the time, in interviews. And like I said, in the Dreamer, he wrote about it, and it was just totally opposite of what he wrote.
It's a centerpiece of the book. It's a centerpiece of his book.
So, but I kind of liken it to like when somebody talks about how they played baseball when they were a kid and they hit 4 home runs in one game or something like that. Maybe they got a base hit. You don't know. He probably figured nobody's ever going to know this, until some goofball 50 years later is going to come across the transcript.
And do you think eventually he just believed it himself?
Yeah, I think people talk themselves into anything. It's, alternate facts thing. People they convince themselves of stuff, whether or not it's true.
But it's just passing no moral judgment. Will Eisner was still an amazing.
Oh, yeah. Like I said,
true legend.
I love the guy. So it's.
But I
felt bad, believe me, when I did it.
How did you fall into this? How did you get into this whole thing about researching the hidden history of comics? What got you interested, and how did you get there?
Okay, well, I'm 68 years old. Okay, and I started reading comics literally 60 years ago. I think it's next month. So I've been doing this, reading comics a long time. And
right before the Marvel age happened.
Actually, during the year that Fantastic Four came out, it just happened. So I got the early issues of that and all that. And that's, to me, is when the Silver Age began, is with Marvel.
Yeah.
I know everybody else argues differently, but anyway.
People say showcase number 4 and 56.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with it, because it wasn't like immediately superheroes became popular after 1956. I mean, Dell was huge during the late 50s. They were by far the biggest comic book company as far as sales were concerned. Superheroes didn't really catch on until first DC had Justice League, which is 1960. And then when Marvel started with, the Fantastic Four in 61 is when superheroes started catching on. That's when the Silver Age really started. But that's one of those arguments that, I've had many times with people. And,
the age
totally
demarcations in comics is...
Exactly. Yeah. I wrote an article called The New Ages about it and that. And again, that's one of those things, but I wrote it with a guy named Jerry Bales, which kind of ties into why I started with this comics history thing. Jerry Bales was a professor at Wayne State University here in Detroit. That's where I'm located, in the Detroit area. And he was one of the earliest comic book fans. And he's the one, a lot of people that call him the father of comic fandom, which isn't, totally true, but he's the one who popularized it. And he would write letters all the time to the letter columns of DC Comics, like Justice League of America, Strange Adventures, Mystery in Space, and things like that, talking about the old comics from the 40s.
Wow.
And he would, he's the first one to bring it up. Like, I was a kid just growing up, and I had no idea that there was comic books, before I was born, superheroes and all that. It's hard for, younger comic fans to understand. There was no continuity of characters in that, except for like Superman, Batman, and stuff like that. It was hard to believe that there was other comic book superheroes and stuff before I was even born. So anyways, Jerry Bales would talk about this stuff. And he became the one who popularized all these things. Well, he just happened to be in the same area I was. And some of the first comic book conventions were put on here in Detroit called the Triple Fanfare. And they started like in 64 or so. And I went to the third one, which is like in 67 or 68. Anyways, I met Jerry Bales. I met these early other comic fans like Rich Buckler and stuff like that. They all came from the same area here. And but Jerry Bales looked at comics not just as a fan, but being a professor, he had it like an academic view of comics. And he also discussed the creators of comics and the history, that there's a history greater than just what was occurring on the comic book page. Like, to a lot of people, comics history is, in Batman so-and-so, with the first appearance of somebody, what I'm saying? That's what, and that isn't an aspect of comics history. But Bales is the one who gave it like a personality, like there's creators behind it. At least for me, he did. And I sort of took off after that because I started reading his things. He had a fanzine he published called Panelologist, which I have all the copies of still, in the late 60s. And he would publish all this information that he had about these, writers, or he would write about the indexing he'd done and stuff like that. And like I said, he treated it in a very systematic, academic type way. And so, like I said, I just picked up after that. So about in the early 70s there, I just started researching all these things, anything I could about the creators of comics. And it's just expanded over time, because I look at comics as a part of real world history, not just, as a something totally separate, unto itself. And that's what basically all my research and writing has been over the years.
Okay, so let's talk about Invisible Men, your new book, The Trailblazing Black Artists of Comic Books. Yep. What prompted you to get on this book, to write this book?
Okay, well, again, I was doing research. Okay, to begin at the real beginning, I was writing a very long overview of St. John Comics, which is a comic book company from the 40s and 50s. And they were known mostly for their romance comics, which are almost all drawn by Matt Baker. Well,
who was an incredible artist.
Incredible artist. I love Matt Baker's work. Well, back about 20 years ago, when I first started researching him, I would ask people about him, which is the way I usually do. Is I start asking other people, hey, do you know anything about so and so? And then I'll work my research off on whatever crumbs I can find. And nobody knew hardly anything about Matt Baker. There's two things they knew: he died young and he was Black. Okay. And at the time, 20 years ago, a lot of people said, oh, he was the only Black ever to work in comic books in the 40s, which made no real sense because, just on pure numbers, you'd have to believe there'd be more than one, to work in comic books during that time. But anyways, that just struck me as odd. So I kept asking around, and finally somebody, and I can't remember who it was, told me to contact this retired Black cartoonist who lived in Philadelphia named Samuel Joyner. And so I located Mr. Joyner, I got his address, and I wrote him a letter. I say, did you know Matt Baker, or do you know anything about Matt Baker? Well, I've written dozens of letters over the years, and a lot of times nobody answers, or you get back a one-line, response or something like that. Like I wrote to Alex Toth. Alex Toth was real receptive, responding something. It was just sarcastic, But Mr. Joyner wrote back a 4-page letter, a beautiful letter, beautifully written, very detailed letter about meeting Matt Baker. And along with it, he gave me some news clippings and photocopies of different art samples and stuff of different Black artists. He said not only was there Matt Baker, there was, he mentioned E.C. Stoner, who I knew, Elmer Stoner, and Jay Jackson and Ted Shearer, and these different cartoonists that he knew. And not all worked in comic books, which is basically, my field of interest. But it just struck me at the time, like, wait a minute, how come nobody's ever said anything about these people before? So I wrote him back immediately, and he gave me a little bit more information, a lot of information about himself, because it turns out he helped. He'd gone to New York. He's from Philadelphia with a friend of his named Cal Massey. Well, Cal Massey was an established comic book artist. Again, nobody had ever written anything about him 20 years ago. And he would help out Cal Massey. So he gave me a little more information about that. So based upon these pieces that he'd given me, I said, like, well, I got to find out more about these, different artists. Well, I started looking in newspapers like I usually would, going through newspaper archives, and there was nothing about any of these artists, which just seemed really odd to me. Because like, if, going through all these newspaper archives, which I've been doing for decades, you usually find little bits here and there, like so-and-so went to school here, or, they went to, they had an art showing or something like that. There was nothing about any of these men. And I said, that's really weird. So I said, but they were Black. So I said, what about Black newspapers? Well, one of the problems with researching anything with Black media and Black newspapers is no library saved them. Like you can go in any library in the United States and find archives of the New York Times or LA Times or Detroit Free Press or Boston Globe. There was no, Chicago Defenders, Pittsburgh Couriers, New York, Amsterdam News anywhere, one source. So I had to start finding these different little archives, which have pieces here and there of newspapers and stuff. Like there'd just be a few, they might just have 10 copies or something. Over time, it's gotten much better because of the internet, which has been a tremendous source of, a lot of this. But so I spent,
it's like those people who were just keeping them for fun and not, not giving them to a
well,
library or anything.
It was almost coincidental that they had some copies, So anyways, as I started researching these Black newspapers, it turns out that most of these guys, they were classically trained fine artists. They were established cartoonists. They were social activists and stuff like that, well known within the Black community. Totally unknown in the white community. And when you read the book, I start out by referencing there was an article written in 1903 by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a Black social activist
Yeah.
and civil rights leader, one of the first. And he wrote this article called The Soul of Black Folks. And he talks in there about a thing called double consciousness. And what it is, he's basically referring to the fact that Blacks in the United States lived in two worlds. They lived in the world of their own community, of associating and living amongst Blacks. And then they had to live in the white community where, they would try to find a job and, and how they had to have almost like a different persona, between these two worlds. And it dawned on me, that's what this was all about, is that these people who were these great artists, and that's almost every single one of these guys was classically trained or been to art school, and they were very good artists. They were totally ignored in the white community. And the only reason why these guys had worked in comic books was just almost by accident. And again, I can give you all the details if you got the time to do it. But what
Got
it was,
the time, yeah.
Okay. In the 1930s, there was the Roosevelt administration had passed a thing called the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. And what the WPA was created for was to give jobs to unemployed artists. Well, most of these unemployed artists who couldn't find jobs in the 1930s during the Great Depression were minority artists. They were Jewish and they were Black, the vast majority of them. And what happened in 1940, it was defunded by Congress. They said it was a waste of money to spend all this money on, employing these artists. Because what these artists were doing were painting murals on buildings. And some had worked on the 1939-40 World's Fair and stuff like that. Most of that was created by WPA artists. So by 1940, 39, 40, it was defunded. So these guys had no jobs. And as a former artist myself, it's very easy to starve to death as an artist. Okay. It really is. You still got to eat, no matter how great you are. So these guys who were fine artists were out on the street again. One of the few places they could get employed was comic books, because one, it was the bottom rung of commercial art. The comic book industry at that time was booming in the early 40s. They were cranking out comic books, by the millions every month. So they would hire virtually anybody. And you could see that if you look at old Golden Age comics, a lot of it's really crappy artwork.
Yeah.
But it was more quantity than quality they were concerned about.
Even someone like Mac Rayboy, who I think is an amazing artist. You can see in his sequential work that he's kind of phoning it in.
Right. Well, the things, he was a WPA artist. Louis Fairstadt was another one. Fantastic artist. You look at his comic book work, it's horrible. When you look at in comparison to what he did.
Yeah.
Well, so a lot of these artists drifted into comics. The first Black one to really establish himself, as a Black artist in comic books was Elmer Stoner, E.C. Stoner. And he was, again, a WPA artist who had worked on the World's Fair. He worked on a lot of, specifically on this train exhibit at the World's Fair. But again, he had to eat and everything. And he was a classically trained artist. He came up during the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. Beautiful artwork he was doing, paintings and stuff like that. But you still got to eat. I mean, it's nice to do a painting once every 6 months, but that's not going to pay the bills. So he drifted into comic books. And Elmer Stoner served as a conduit for other Black artists afterwards. And I found several articles referring to that in the Black media, how Elmer Stoner helped so-and-so get into comic books. Because there's almost no other way they're going to work in commercial artwork, in commercial art. So he served as a conduit for these guys who came along afterwards. And, you could see it almost in the comic books that he did, because he did a huge amount of comic books. During the 40s. One of these days, I'm going to have to make a complete list, but from 1944 to 1946, he drew the cover of every single Fox comic. It's almost none of them, only a handful have ever been identified, like in the Grand Comics database and stuff like that. but he did the cover of every single one. He did tons of stories for Fox, he worked for Dell and all these other companies. Huge amount of work, but almost none of it's been identified as his. You know, people just never spent a lot of time looking at his artwork. Well, anyway, the other thing that allowed blacks to get into comics was World War II. And again, it was just a freak thing, because what happened when World War II broke out and they started the draft, they actually started in 1940, but when they started really drafting a lot of guys, the local draft boards wouldn't draft blacks, even though they were eligible to be drafted. When their name would come up, they would skip over them because they didn't know if they could trust blacks in the military. So till like late 1943, there's hardly any blacks entering the military unless they enlisted. So the vast majority of young black artists were, again, left home, but the white artists were being drafted. So the comic book companies needed artists. And again, it provided opportunity. And I liken to like women entering factory work here in Detroit, the Rosie the Riveters and stuff like that. It's a very similar situation.
It's exactly what I was thinking of when you were describing it, actually.
Right. It's a very similar situation. And they were filling a space that, you know, white men would have had. And once World War II ended and these white artists came back, almost immediately these black artists stopped getting jobs. You know, and you could see it. I mean, when you read the book, you'll see that almost all the artwork for the black artists stopped in 1946, by 1946, except for a handful of them, like
Crazy.
Matt Baker and Hollingsworth. The ones who were the best ones, you know, the most talented ones, you know, stayed. But the ones who were kind of marginal artists and stuff, they stopped getting jobs. They just stopped hiring them. And the other thing that helped them out was the existence of what we call comic shops. They were comic studios.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay, and
like the Eisner Iger shop and
exactly. There was Eisner and Iger, Harry Chesler, Jack Binder, the Majestic one, which is Adolph Rowe owned, and there was a number of them. You know, and what it was is they were packagers. People have this idea that the comic book artists work for comic book companies like they do now, like a bullpen or something like that, like at Marvel. It wasn't like that back in those days. Back in the 40s, a guy would set up a studio, and what he would do is he would go to the editor or the publisher and say, like, what do you need? And like I said, they were more concerned about quantity than quality. They said, I need 5 comics and I need them, you know, 2 weeks from now. Well, obviously he couldn't do it by himself. So what he would do is he would just hire a bunch of guys literally off the street. A lot of times they were young kids like Kubert, and that started when he was 14 years old. There was guys like that, and they would hire people off the street. So the people they had to work with, you know, where, they're just grinding out these comics as fast as they could. And they called them comic shops because they were very similar to like a factory situation. They would literally just get a loft like in New York, fill it with drawing tables, and they'd have artists sitting next to each other, elbow to elbow, just cranking out these comics. And a lot of times they would do a 64-page comic in a weekend, just to give you an idea is how fast they could do this. Okay.
I'm thinking of that Submariner and Human Torch comic.
Right. That's very similar. That was the Funnies Incorporated shop that did that. And that was Lloyd Jacquet. But anyways, these comic shops provided an opportunity to blacks, because blacks, and again, a lot of them referred to, a lot of the, in interviews I read with these black artists, they referred to the fact that they couldn't walk into an editor's office with their portfolio because one, most times they get rejected, or they didn't know what kind of response they would get. They wouldn't get a job, basically, if they walked in physically themselves. But by working through a comic shop, they had this buffer between them and the editor. The owners of the shops couldn't care less who they hired. And the editors and the publishers just wanted material. So there was this buffer between the black artist and the editor of the comic shop. You see what I'm saying? It provided them with this buffer. And because Alvin Hollingsworth was one guy who wrote quite a bit about that, the fact, how he resented that he couldn't talk to a white editor himself. He had to go through a shop and stuff. So there was another advantage they had during World War II, was the fact that they had these comic shops as an intermediary between them and the publishers. So it was just a confluence of events that allowed the blacks to enter that brief period during World War II as comic book artists. But there was a number of them who did it. And again, it's been ignored by history. And part of the reason why is due to the fact of these comic shops again, because you could work for a comic shop from home. A lot of them have their own studio, like Stoner and Hollingsworth. They would have their own studio at home. So they would do their assignment at home, bring it in, drop it off at the comic shop, and then go back home. So any white artist around didn't even know who they were. I mean, I've talked to a number of Golden Age artists, didn't even know there was black artists working. The only ones they knew would be Matt Baker, because he physically worked in the studio. He sat next to Al Feldstein, as a matter of fact. He would physically work in the studio in Alvin Hollingsworth. Other than those two, none of the Golden Age artists I've ever talked to knew of any other black artist. And it's because they didn't even work with them.
Is it so?
You see what I'm saying?
So they didn't see them and they just assumed they were white?
They didn't know. They didn't know who these guys were. You see what I'm saying? And that's why the whole concept of invisible men is literally nobody saw them. I mean, physically, they never saw them, and they never even considered the fact that they might have been black. I mean, one of the best examples to me was, have you heard of Maurice Whitman? He did a lot of work for Fiction House and stuff like that. He became fairly well known on his own, fairly well known. Well, the early part of his career, about the first 2 or 3 years, he worked exclusively with an artist named Ezra Jackson, a black artist named Ezra Jackson. And as far as I can tell, they would switch off between the penciling and inking, but they would sign, the stories together and stuff like that, with both their names on it or a combination of their names. And he worked with them frequently. Well, I contacted Maurice Whitman's son, who's still around. Mm-hmm. I said, "Did your dad ever talk about Ezra Jackson?" He goes, "No." I said, "Well, he was a black artist. Did you ever refer to working with this black artist?" He goes, "No, he never worked with a black artist." So there's a good chance Maurice Whitman, even though he worked with this artist exclusively, never even saw him. He might have been getting the pencil artwork and inking it, or he was sending off his pencils and getting them ink by artists he never even saw.
It's amazing.
And it was amazing to me that this could go on. But that's the way the world was, Joy. I mean, it was two different worlds. And if you read the black media that time, like I said, I've read thousands of black newspapers now, okay? It's like it's like stepping from one universe into another. You wouldn't believe the difference. And I've often said that now I believe that they should teach, every history class in this country should have a semester devoted to different perspectives of history. And the best way to do it for like black history, to me, is through the black media of that time, because it was a very rich and vital media at the time. The best black writers, the best black artists, all were working for these newspapers. I mean, you would have Langston Hughes, you would have
incredible,
Richard Wright, all these guys who became famous writers outside of the world of black media, who were working in these newspapers. And the same thing with the comic book artists. All these comic book artists worked in the black media, all of them, and they were all celebrated artists. Robert Pius, one of the artists I covered in the book there, he was a political cartoonist in the black media from the early 40s right up to the 1980s. And you can find his work in every single black newspaper you come across. In the white media, there's nothing about this man at all, okay? Yet he was an icon. He has a painting of Sojourner Truth in the National Gallery in Washington, okay? You don't know anything about that. Cal Massey. Cal Massey was celebrated in that. Cal Massey was the leading artist for Franklin Mint. For years, he designed all their medals and everything and stuff like that. He was their top artist. Almost nothing about him until recently, in the past couple of years, that people even mentioned them. And it's on and on and on like that with these artists. It is an amazing, as a white man, like I told people, I was embarrassed reading, doing this research. I'm like, how can I not know this? Like I've spent, 50 years doing comics research. My background is fine art. I know art history. I've taken, a half a dozen art history classes. None of these men are mentioned. It's like they never existed. And again, it's invisible men. That's what the book is centered around.
Turns out art history, much like all history, is filtered through a white lens, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's just weird. When you read it, and like I say, for a white guy, I was embarrassed, reading it. And that's what this book is. It's kind of like it's almost my experience. People almost see my process of how I came across this information, when you read the book. And my introduction kind of explains, the process I went through here. Because unfortunately, the book can only contain so much of my research. I mean, I probably have 3 times of what actually appears in the book, which is hard to believe. It's 250 pages, but I could go on and on and on. And I'm obsessive when I do research. I go down rabbit holes that people can't believe. I mean, I acquired books that there's only a couple hundred copies were ever printed of, written by, Black writers. So I tried understanding as much as I could of a Black person's mentality during that time, because it's hard to understand how they could live in these 2 different worlds like that. I mean, one of the things you'll notice when you read the book is that a lot of times the assignments they would get in comic books would be things for like Fiction House and Fox, where they're drawing these white jungle lords or these white jungle princesses, who are, ruling the savages and beating them up and stuff like that. And these guys were Black artists, and you go like, what were they thinking? What was going through, how could you do that? Because again, as an artist, it's easy for me to say like, I wouldn't do that. But if you got to eat, you got to eat, and you got to do what you got to do. And it's, I don't know, again, the whole thing was a revelation to me, in writing this book. And again, I think that's what a lot of people like, when they're reading it, because for most, white comic fans and stuff, I think just comic fans in general don't even know this stuff. Didn't even know this stuff ever, happened.
No, I can tell you, I know I'm a Filipino, but I know, and I think most comic fans would know more Filipino artists than Black artists.
Right.
Like,
Oh yeah.
going historically.
I love Filipino artists that like Tony Gizanega and Alex Nino and all those guys like that. Nestor Redondo. I used to have a beautiful Nestor Redondo Rima illustration, original on that for years.
Alcala was my favorite.
Oh, Alcala, another one. That's what I mean. All those, I love those artists. Matter of fact, they were some of the ones that I used to copy off of all the time. When I was starting out.
They're
love their art.
They're insane. But I mean, you grew up in the '60s. Right. That's the, it's the hallmark. It's the milestone for the civil rights movement. How did that shape you as a person leading?
It did. Of course, it did. Well, it always strikes me as kind of funny. Again, knowing what I know now, that, like, for instance, the Black Panther is so iconic, such an iconic character and everything like that, which I understand, but it was created by 2 white guys in the 1960s. 2 white Jewish guys in 1960s. Blacks were creating similar characters back in the 1940s. Like I just recently showed how Jay Jackson, while he was working for the Chicago Defender, did a whole storyline about this character named Speed Jackson, who goes and finds this civilization in Africa that's been lost for years. It's basically Wakanda, and he spent 6 months there doing it. Nobody knows about it. You see what I'm saying? You know, but he did it back in the mid 1940s. You know, it's just like I say, we have such a myopic view of things. You know, and that's what I try to do with my articles. I want people to expand their horizons. I say, like, yeah, comics are great, but there's more to it than that. You know, it's such a wide, you know, widen your view here because there's so much more. Like, I love foreign comics. Okay,
Yeah.
I study a lot. Like, I'm doing an article right now, a huge article about Andre LeBlanc. It's going to, in the next couple of months, I'll have it all finished. But Andre LeBlanc worked here in the United States, and he is known as basically he worked for Will Eisner. And he did some a backup feature for Will Eisner. And he worked in comics in the 60s and 70s, like for Dell and stuff. And he did a lot of religious comics here. But he also worked in South America. He was from Haiti originally, but he married a Brazilian woman and moved to Brazil in 1944 and spent the next 15 years down there. He's literally a legend in South America. Again, we don't even know about it here in the United States, but he basically created the Brazilian art community, especially the comic art community in that. He was their top commercial artist for years. He created a comic strip that's like literally their greatest comic strip was called Marina Floor. Okay. Again, it's something we're totally unaware of here in the United States. And I've got almost all these things. It's taken me years. I even located his daughter in Portugal. She's living in Portugal now. And she helped me with this information, some of this stuff in there. But, you know, I just want people to understand that there's far more to the comic book than what we give it credit for. You know, I love the fact that comics are popular now, because I grew up in a time where they would laugh at you, the fact that you read comics and everything like that, you know, especially in the 1960s and stuff.
A lot of fans are not happy that they're popular now.
Oh yeah, right. But you know, they're literally a genre unto itself in movies. I mean, they're basically what keep movies going, you know, right now. But again, I just want people to understand the history behind it. Because like when you study art history, you're not just looking at a painting, you know, you want to know about Van Gogh's life or Rembrandt's life or something like that. And that's what I try to do.
For the record, I too am happy that they're popular now. There's so many more people to talk to about the things that I love.
Oh. Well, like I said, they just wrote an article in the New York Times and a couple other newspapers about me. I can guarantee you 40 years ago, that wouldn't have
doesn't happen, right?
Right. You know, but
I mean, so you're talking about Matt Baker. I think he's an amazing artist. I think we're both in the same Facebook group, Comic Book Historians. Matt Baker gets posted quite a bit.
Right.
Do you think he'd have more of a lasting legacy if he had created one of those characters that had lasted forever?
Right. See, that's the whole thing, because we're so superhero focused, it's obscured the actual history of comics. I mean, superheroes were only popular a couple times throughout comic book history. They were popular in the early 1940s. This actually, you know, era I write about mostly here. But then after World War II, there was a long drought where there was hardly any superhero comics. You know, and that's why I said, like, when they say the Silver Age started in 1956, the showcase number 4, that's ludicrous. And even Jerry Bale said that because he was around at that time. You know, he could speak to it personally. He said when Showcase 4 came out, yeah, it sold okay, but they didn't realize until like the Flash had, like, I think 4 appearances in Showcase. He'd already done 2 or 3 appearances in Showcase before they realized, well, he might be a character we'll keep around. It wasn't like they immediately started publishing all these superhero comics. There were no other superheroes. I mean, Green Lantern was redone in 1960. Then, you know, the Atom was redone in 61 or 62. So there was years later. It wasn't an immediate thing that happened. It wasn't something that flipped a switch in 1956. You know, comics were just barely recovering from the whole Frederick Wordham controversy and stuff like that in 1956. You know, they were just hanging on. And the only comics that were selling basically were Walt Disney's comics and stories and Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and things like that from Dell. You know, again, Bale's always said,
Carl Barks.
What? Right.
Carl Barks, yeah.
Right, Carl Barks, yeah. I mean, it was great stuff, but the point is, it wasn't superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
But superhero fans so dominate, the comic fandom community, it obscures the actual history of what happened. And again, I try to expand people's horizons. I kind of swim against the current on a lot of things in that, because I look at things from a different perspective a lot of times. I don't persecute people.
I love hearing that stuff. I love hearing that stuff because I pretty much try to do the same thing with this channel, like just bring in all of comics as much as I can.
Right. Like I said, it bothers me that the people don't give comics enough credit. It's like there's all sorts of talented people making comic books. There's always been like that. There's some people were geniuses, some people are hacks. There's all different things going on. Comic books always follow trends that are going on in the rest of the world. Like when there's these anti-comic Atlas comics in the early 50s, that didn't happen in a vacuum. They were just responding to what was going on in the rest of the country at the time. And so comic books very much are a reflection of what's going on in the world, except they usually are a little bit behind, just due to the fact, because, they're not printed immediately. There's a lag time there. But they're very much a reflection of what's going on in the world. And again, that's something I try to show through newspaper articles and stuff like that. And when I write about them.
Speaking of it being a reflection of what's going on in the world, how important is it to you, as somebody who grew up in the 60s, that this book comes out now at this point in our history?
Oh, for one thing, it's just a total coincidence. Okay. I finished the book 2.5 years ago. Okay. But what happened was the publisher, which is Craig Yo in IDW, he's an imprint of IDW.
Yeah.
They didn't know what to do with my book because it's so totally different from basically anything else that they publish. They didn't know how they should release it, how they should market it, anything like that. So by the time they figured it out, it just happened to, come out when all this stuff about, the civil rights thing became such a focus this past year.
Yeah.
Social justice and all stuff like that. It's just coincidental that it came out during that time. But I am glad that it came out during this time, because what it does, it gives people a better perspective, because I go a lot into the history of these men. Again, when you read the book, you'll see that. I don't just talk about their comic book work. I talk about where they came from. I talk about where their family came from. Sometimes I go back generations, with Stoner, for instance. One of his great-grandmother was one of George Washington's wives' slaves, okay? And she was freed in the early 1800s. That's where I start his story from, and I trace it right through, in each one of these artists, I do that. Because, again, nothing happens in a vacuum. Everybody is a collection of their experiences and their past. And, and I try to show that with each one of these artists. And I think that's one of the things I hope that people get from this book, is they get a better understanding of why, the social justice movement that's going on in this country now, why it's so important, because there's a history to it. And again, if people could read these Black newspapers, for instance, there was like 1,500 lynchings in this country between, I think, like 1915 and 1950. Okay.
Wow.
Which is staggering when you think about it. And there's probably more, but they figure it's at least that many. If you read white newspapers during that time period, you rarely saw them mentioned.
Well, they'll never mention it.
No, if they did, it may have been in the back page somewhere, the so-and-so was lynched, or they found somebody lynched. In Black newspapers, it was headline news. Okay, it would be a headline, so-and-so was lynched in this little town somewhere. Or a police brutality, there was some Blacks were beaten up by officers for whatever, anytime there's a confrontation between white and Blacks, the Blacks always ended up getting beat up by cops and arrested every single time. Okay. And you see this over and over and over again.
It's not a
Well,
new thing.
again, it's not. But that's why when people see these things, on the news and stuff like that, there's a history. It didn't just start and stuff like that. It was a far more brutal history because there was the Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. I mean, blacks were physically not allowed to go to certain places, mostly in the South, but even in places like New York. New York, they had a ferry that went between New York and some city in New Jersey, that they had a black, and this is the 1950s, okay? They had a separate black bathroom on the ferry because whites and blacks. Think about it. That's New York
That's
City.
New York City.
New York City in the 1950s. And I got the articles for it. It's stuff like that. People don't understand that.
Did you experience that stuff yourself, having grown up, in the
No,
60s?
I just see, I'm from the Detroit area. And
Yeah.
it's at least where I'm from, and it's always been very integrated and stuff like that. I've always known blacks. I've always worked with blacks and stuff. And we never even had any problems, on a day-to-day basis and stuff like that. But there wasn't the segregated kind of thing, at least not around where I was, as there was in other parts of the country. Because I grew up in, I can barely remember the 1950s, but throughout the 1960s. And then the whole civil rights thing, occurred during that time period and stuff like that. But it's again, it's a revelation. And I think that, more people should be exposed to it because there are different perspectives and you understand. And once people understand things, Dwight, there's a lot less anger. And there's a lot less pushback and stuff like that. It's just that the people are so fixed in their positions, they don't want to back off. They don't want to give an inch and stuff like that. But if you're exposed to people, what people have actually gone through, I think you're a lot more understanding, And again, I think that's one of the things I think people get out of this book, at least to a certain extent. I have a background in journalism, okay? And I learned to treat subjects objectively, okay? Any biases I have in that, I try to set aside and I report what I find. And that's what I did with this book here. I don't create a narrative. I don't preach to people or anything like that. I just present these news articles, the news information. I just present the stories very straightforward and even-handed as I can. And I let people discover for themselves what happens. I don't have to tell them this is what happens. It's like taking a photograph and handing a photograph to somebody, say, you figure out what's going on.
People like to say, the truth has a liberal bias. What do you think about that?
What, the news?
Yeah, the truth.
Well, again, everything is perspective. And that's one of the things I go on here. If you look at something from a conservative perspective, of course you're going to think that. But if you look from a liberal perspective, you go like, what are you talking about?
It's just balanced.
So, right. I understand. So I try to understand every side of the subject if I can. I don't condemn anybody for what they believe unless they're a violent whack job or something like that, because everybody has a different experience, Doy. I don't know what their experience is. I don't know what they've gone through in their life and stuff like that. Again, if people learn to understand other people, give people credit. You'll be a lot less angry.
And you grew up in the 60s and you've always had, you've always been progressive in that sense.
Right.
But it seems to me that you still had to confront some truths about, yourself and your privilege while writing this book.
Right. See, it's like I said, again, so I grew up, okay, to give you an idea, in 1972, I worked for George McGovern, okay? I was threatened with a gun when I was doing canvassing, because he was in favor of busing at the time, which was, busing black from their area to white schools and stuff like that. Well, I was threatened with a gun one time, doing canvassing. Another time I was protesting the Vietnam War, bombing in Cambodia, in Detroit, and we were literally surrounded by Nazis, by American Nazis.
Oh my God!
The police had, it was a thing. There's a thing in Detroit called Kennedy Square. It's called Cadillac Square now, and we were down there protesting. We were just a small group, like 50 people. Well, these American Nazis came. They surrounded us, and the police had us stand literally, like we were a couple feet away from them, between us, and these were guys with like black uniforms and stuff like that. This wasn't, kidding around type stuff. These guys wanted to kill us.
It's 72?
Yeah. There's a group called Breakthrough. Guy's name was Donald Lobsinger. Oh, I'll never forget it. I mean, that was a scary situation. But I'm talking about, that's my kind of background. So, when you read these articles and you go like, I feel like an idiot. I thought I knew what was going on, but I didn't know what was going on, in the Black community and stuff like that, until you actually see things from their perspective. And you see that when you read the Black newspapers and the Black media.
Yeah. Wow. I'm
Yeah.
sorry you
Well,
had to go through that.
Yeah. Well, again, everything's a learning experience. And,
I recognize three things from the cover of your book. One is the Blue Beetle.
Yeah. Yes.
One is the Phantom Lady.
Yes.
And one is the front character for a one-shot called All Negro Comics.
Right.
That there's a really bad, a really weird history behind that book. Is it true that they were completely priced out of the market?
Well, what it was is Philadelphia, for some reason, it was a hotbed for all these artists. So many of the artists I wrote about either lived in Philadelphia or came to Philadelphia at some time. And that's partly due to history too, because prior to 1910, 80% of Blacks in this country lived south of the Mason-Dixon line, which people don't understand. They were almost all in those southern states there. And there was a thing that occurred in the early 1900s called the Great Migration. And that's when Blacks started moving north. And the first city they usually came to in the north, across the Mason-Dixon line, major city, was Philadelphia. So a lot of Blacks located there. And a lot of these Black artists came out of that area. Well, one of the people who was located there was Orrin C. Evans. And he was one of the first Blacks to work in a white newsroom. He worked for white newspapers. And this is in the early 1900s. Well, he worked for Black and white newspapers throughout his career, and he was very well respected. Well, in the 1940s, he was working for the Philadelphia Record, the same paper, as a matter of fact, that published the Spirit in that city.
Okay.
Anyways, the paper was undergoing a labor movement where they were trying to organize some of columnists and people who worked on the paper. The union was trying to get into it. Well, rather than do that, they shut the paper down. They just closed it down, and the paper went out of business. Well, this is like 1947. So Evans, who was a writer and an editor at the paper at the time, got an idea, and he hired a couple of the other editors who worked on the Philadelphia Record, and they were all white guys, coincidentally enough. And he formed a thing called All Negro Comics, like Incorporated, because he wanted to publish a comic book that was created and published by Blacks, because there was none. There was no such thing that that a Black would own a publishing company. So what he did is he got his brother George, who was a student at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and they got a couple of the art students there, Black art students. And he also hired a guy named John Terrell. John Terrell was an established Black cartoonist who'd been working in Black newspapers. He worked for the New York Amsterdam News. Well, but during this time, he was working in Philadelphia shipyard as an illustrator, drawing safety posters and stuff like that. He hired him too. And he had them create different comic characters. The one who's on the cover of Invisible Men is Ace Harlem. He's a detective. He's sort of like kind of like a Dick Tracy. It almost looks like Dick Tracy.
It's a great name.
Yeah, Ace Harlem, isn't it? I love that name. But anyways, he created Ace Harlem, and it was Orrin C. Evans wrote it, but John Terrell drew it. And they did a few other characters. They did one called Lion Man. His brother George Evans did that one, which was basically, it was about a Black scientist who graduated, I think, from Howard University. And he goes to Africa, and he becomes like not a superhero so much, but almost like a Tarzan kind of guy, only an educated one, and he's black, and he helps the black natives against these white interlopers who come there. And that's what his, origin story was. Well, anyways, they published one issue, and it must not got very good distribution because it's an extremely rare comic, to find even today. Well, there was a second issue created, but never published. And the story that had been told by Evans' family was that he couldn't get a paper company to sell him the paper to publish a black comic book, which he did for the first issue. And I don't know how he did that unless he had an intermediary do it. But for the second issue, he couldn't get anybody to sell him the paper. So it never was published. And that was the story of that comic. Again,
things we never even consider in the production of a comic, the purchasing of the paper.
Well, in the papers, that's key,
Yeah.
But there's a lot of things, subtle discriminatory things that were done over the years that people never realized. Another classic one, it has to do with Matt Baker. He created a character called Voodoo, okay, or Voodah, excuse me, Voodah. And he created it for this off-the-wall comic company, some small comic company. And what it was is he's the first mainstream comic black character to have his own feature in a comic book. This is 1945. Okay, there was no black character had his own feature in a comic. And Matt Baker created this one. What was interesting about it, though, is that he appeared in this comic called Crown Comics. On the cover, Voodah would appear as a white character. He looked like Tarzan or any of these other white jungle lords and stuff like that. But on the interior, for the first 6 issues, he was black, and there's no doubt about it. It wasn't like a miscoloring or something like that. He was definitely a black character. And the reason why they did that is because in the South, they would never put a comic on stands that showed a black character in a positive light. So they had him as white on the cover, but black on the interior. And then 6 issues in, they changed Voodah to a white character on the interior too.
That's insane.
I know. Think about that. But it's one of those subtle things that people wouldn't have noticed.
And how do you feel knowing about all of that? And being around this year, this year, like Milestone is coming back, and
right. That's what I mean. There's all this history out there, Joy, that people don't even realize, and that's again all part of the stuff that I bring out in this book here. It's very interesting, But again, I try to do it in a matter-of-fact way. I don't have to beat people over the head with it. I just tell them what happened. And that's exactly what happens. That was the world at the time.
The truth is interesting.
Yeah.
And my last question for you has nothing to do with the book. I'm looking very forward to seeing the book and reading the book. My last question for you, I like to end on things that have nothing to do with comics.
Okay.
Can you tell us about your relation to somebody who showed up on Happy Days?
Oh. Yeah, Susie Quattro is my cousin. She's my second cousin, actually, in that, but we used to see each other as kids and stuff. We all live in the same area, the Detroit area here. And her whole family's very musical, and they put together a group here. Matter of fact, they had one of the first girl rock groups ever back in the 1960s called the Pleasure Seekers, her and her sisters. Yeah. Well, Susie, there was a record promoter from Britain called Mickey Most, and he was very big in Britain at the time. He created he promoted a lot of these groups like I'm trying to think of some of the groups like Bay City Rollers.
Okay.
I'm trying to think the guy who did Gary Glitter, that was all Mickey Most stuff that he produced. Well, he saw Susie in the Pleasure Seekers like in 1971, and he liked her look. She's real short. She's barely 5 feet tall, and he just liked her look. She plays a bass guitar, and that bass guitar is as big as she is and stuff. And she had this real rocky type attitude and stuff. Again, that's part of the whole Detroit area scene, because we had a lot of Iggy and the Stooges and stuff like that at the same time, the MC5 and all that. So it was, it was always like an edge to Detroit rock anyway.
Detroit
so
Rock
he
City.
liked her look. Exactly. So he took her back to Britain, and he created a group around her. Well, she became huge in England. And at one time, from the early 70s, she was the biggest rock star in the world outside the United States. It was weird. I mean, I used to get these British magazines. We would all laugh about it. That's Susie. What's she doing? She's this huge rock star in England and Japan and all these other countries. So, anyways, Gary Marshall, who produced Happy Days, saw a poster of Susie on his daughter's wall. He just liked the way she looked. She's wearing this leather and all stuff like that. And so it was a real bad attitude. And he hired her for Happy Days. On Happy Days, they totally defanged her and had her singing these little sweet little,
of course,
50s type songs. It was so bizarre. The whole thing was just weird. And she was on it for like 6 episodes or so. Anyways, and her, just so you know, her niece, her sister's daughter is Sherilyn Fenn. If you know anything about if you were to watch Twin Peaks, she was Audrey on Twin Peaks.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's her niece, who was also a cousin of mine too. Okay. And she became notorious in our family because she appeared in Playboy soon after, and she dated Billy Idol and all this other stuff. And, a bunch of conservative Italians here in Detroit. It was just kind of bizarre. All this. Anyways, that's all part of my family's scary history.
colorful family history. And
it is. Yeah.
Congratulations on the book, Ken.
Well, thank you very much, Dwight. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming on.
Sure. Anytime.